continuing to work on the wiring, and so what I'm doing is I'm going to wire in for the porch light and for the courtesy light inside the teardrops. So here are the wires that I've run. These are 12 gauge stranded wire, and I think stranded wire is recommended for in teardrops and things like that because it's a little bit more robust when it comes to vibrations. So this is just stranded wire. Got it from one of the big box stores. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to strip a segment about an inch long, something like that. Got to be really careful that you don't nick the wires or cut any of the wires inside. I'm going to do that here, and I'm going to do that here. Now, there's a couple of school of thought on this. Some people will run a pair of wires to every single outlet, every single appliance in the teardrop. I've chosen not to do that. I just want to keep the size of the wiring bundles down, make it a little simpler. At least I think it's a little simpler. So, but what I am going to do is, rather than putting all these together in one big bundle, I am going to have two separate connections to these main trunk wires. So if I do get a failure in one of my solder joints or anything like that, that it doesn't affect the other one. So I'm going to go ahead and strip that. Give you an idea. Just take a sharp knife. So you just got to work at it a little bit because the wires are already run. You've got to kind of pull on them a little bit. So I'll continue to work on this and strip that, and I'll be back in a second. Okay, so I've stripped the wires here. Now what I got to do is just strip the ends of these. And these are the wires that are coming from the utility light, I think, inside, the courtesy light. So, all right. Now, one of the things that's important is I've decided to solder these, and the reason I'm doing that rather than using one of the saddle taps or something like that is I just think that it's a little more reliable. Since this is going to be a closed-up area, I won't be able to get to it if there's a failure. I want to make it as reliable as possible, so I am going to solder these. So I'll solder these together, and then I've got some shrink wrap tubing that I've threaded over the wire here, and then I'll shrink wrap this tubing over the solder joint. And so hopefully that'll seal it well and make it neat and keep it good and insulated. So the first thing I'll do is I'll just wrap this wire around here. I want to wrap it pretty tight. I want to get a pretty good mechanical connection, like that. Now when you do this, you got to make sure, and I almost made this mistake on another one here, is I had the shrink wrap on the wrong side, and that wouldn't have been a good thing. So So I'm going to use a relatively high wattage soldering iron. You wouldn't have to do this. I just happen to have one, and with this big wire it makes it a little easier. This is an old soldering iron that I've had for a long time. And when you're soldering, you just got to make sure that you get the joint itself pretty good and hot, because you're wanting the solder to go into the joint, not sit on the joint. So you can see it's starting to turn now. to be good and hot. Alright, there's one of them. And then I'll go ahead and do the other one. So those are soldered. We'll let those cool down a little bit. It's also important to remember when you're soldering electrical wire like this is you want to use rosin core solder, not acid core solder like you would on plumbing parts. So this is rosin core solder. The acid core solder will corrode that joint, and so the rosin core shouldn't do that. So put the heat shrink over here. And I'm going to go ahead and solder these up here as well, and then I'll come back and shrink the heat shrink tubing. Okay, now what I'm going to do is just shrink the heat shrink tubing down around my solder joints. And I'm using a heat gun. You can do this a lot of different ways. You can actually do it with a lighter or something like that. I find a heat gun to be pretty controllable, and I've also found that the heat gun's a pretty useful thing to have. So I went ahead and bought one. Actually, I bought it, didn't buy it to do this. I bought it to pull up some old pile and stuff like that. So this is how it works. And I've just got the heat gun set on low setting. You can see that shrinking up. So there you've got a good joint. Once that cools off a little bit, it actually becomes pretty rigid, and it's shrunk around the joint, and so should be pretty good. So I'll go ahead and do that with all the rest of them. So now I've got to drill the holes to mount the reading lights, and this is a hard thing to do because this is all nice and finished, but it's got to be done. So I'm just going to use my Forstner bit. I've drilled a pilot hole here, so. Okay, you want to make sure you go down a layer or two, and then I'm going to go to the outside and drill coming back in, so that way I'll have a clean hole on both sides. So it's clean enough. So I'm going to mount the light in here. It's one of those kind of things where you really need 3 hands to do it. Let's see if I can do it.